The scariest part about getting older isn't the wrinkles or the gray hair, it's the moment the world quietly decides it no longer needs you. Evelyn Harper was 45 years old when she first felt herself disappearing. Not all at once. Not dramatically. It happened slowly, silently, like a photograph fading under sunlight. For nearly 20 years, Evelyn had worked for the same logistics company outside Tampa, Florida. She wasn't the kind of employee people celebrated loudly at office parties. She wasn't flashy. She didn't know how to network or flatter executives. But she showed up every single morning before 8, answered emails nobody else wanted to answer, stayed late when deadlines piled up, and quietly believed that loyalty still meant something in America. Then came the rainy Thursday afternoon that changed everything. Her manager, Michael Dawson, called her into his office just before 5 o'clock. Evelyn still remembered the sound of the rain hitting the windows behind him while he spoke. He used words like restructuring, budget cuts, economic pressure. His voice sounded strangely distant, as if she were underwater listening to someone speak from another room. Evelyn stared at the white envelope sitting on the desk between them. Inside was a severance package and 20 years of her life reduced to a few typed pages. She nodded politely because she didn't know what else to do. Then she walked out carrying a cardboard box filled with framed family photos, an old coffee mug, and 2 dying desk plants nobody had watered in weeks. By the time she reached the parking garage, the rain had become heavier. Evelyn sat inside her Honda Accord with the engine off and finally broke down crying. Not graceful tears. Not cinematic tears. The kind that leave your chest aching and your throat burning because something inside you suddenly realizes life is no longer stable. Her mortgage payment was due in 12 days. Her younger daughter needed braces. Her oldest was halfway through community college. Her mother's medication alone cost nearly $300 every month. Evelyn gripped the steering wheel so tightly her fingers hurt. For the first time in years, she felt truly afraid. The weeks after that passed like a gray blur. Every morning, Evelyn woke up with heaviness pressing against her chest before her feet even touched the floor. She spent hours sitting in front of her laptop searching job listings that all sounded the same. Fast-paced environment. Seeking young, energetic candidates. Digital native preferred. Sometimes she stared at those words for so long her vision blurred. Young, energetic candidates. It was amazing how a sentence could make a person feel invisible. One afternoon at the grocery store, Evelyn quietly removed items from her cart before reaching checkout. Orange juice. Ice cream. Name-brand cereal. She pretended to compare prices while secretly calculating how many days remained before her savings account dropped below 4 digits. The cashier smiled at her politely, never noticing the embarrassment burning behind Evelyn's tired eyes. A week later, she drove 40 minutes to a job interview at a medical supply company. Evelyn wore her best navy blazer and arrived 20 minutes early. She answered every question carefully and smiled until her cheeks hurt. But the moment the hiring manager said, "We'll call you soon," she already knew. She had seen the look before. The polite disappointment. The subtle calculation happening behind someone's eyes when they decide you are simply too old to invest in. Evelyn somehow made it back to the parking lot before collapsing into tears again. She sat inside the car while people walked past carrying coffee cups and office badges and normal lives. At that moment, Evelyn felt less like a human being and more like an outdated machine the world was quietly replacing. That evening, she drove home slowly through the wet Florida streets while the sky turned dark above the city. She had no idea that somewhere ahead of her, sitting quietly beside a lake in a small neighborhood park, an elderly woman with silver hair and a pair of old headphones was about to change the course of her life forever. The apartment had never felt this quiet before. Not even after Evelyn divorced 15 years earlier. Back then, there had still been movement in the house. School. Lunches to prepare. Soccer uniforms draped over chairs. Late-night homework at the kitchen table. But now the silence felt different. Heavy. The kind that pressed against the walls after midnight and made every small sound feel enormous. Evelyn sat alone at the kitchen counter staring at her laptop screen while cold coffee rested untouched beside her. It was nearly 2:30 in the morning. Another rejection email had just appeared in her inbox. Thank you for your interest. We have decided to move forward with other candidates. The wording was always polite. Always professional. But after a while, every message sounded exactly the same. Evelyn closed the laptop slowly and rubbed her tired eyes. She could feel a headache building behind them again. Lately, her body carried exhaustion the way old houses carried moisture. Quietly. Permanently. She walked to the refrigerator and opened it without really knowing why. Half a gallon of milk. Eggs. Leftover pasta in a plastic container. A jar of pickles. She stood there staring at the shelves for several seconds before closing the door again. Even groceries had become emotional now. Every item came with calculations attached to it. Every purchase felt like a negotiation with fear. The next morning, Florida sunlight spilled through the blinds far too early. Evelyn barely slept 3 hours, but she forced herself out of bed anyway. She needed to look productive. Needed to feel useful. She put on sneakers and drove to a strip mall where a temporary employment agency was holding walk-in interviews. The waiting room was crowded with people 20 years younger than her. Young men wearing fitted dress shirts while scrolling confidently through their phones. Women with smooth skin and sharp resumes speaking in polished corporate voices. Evelyn sat quietly in the corner clutching her folder against her chest. At one point she caught her reflection in the glass door beside her. The lines around her eyes suddenly looked deeper than she remembered. She wondered when that happened. A young receptionist eventually called her name. The interview lasted less than 15 minutes. The recruiter smiled kindly enough, but Evelyn noticed how quickly his attention drifted while she spoke about her experience. Nearly 2 decades of loyalty suddenly sounded outdated inside that bright modern office. On the drive home, traffic crawled beneath the humid afternoon heat. Evelyn stopped at a red light beside a city bus bench where a handwritten advertisement was taped crookedly to the glass. Community yard sale Saturday. Furniture. Clothing. Household items. The words lingered in her mind longer than they should have. That evening, Evelyn opened her closet and stared at rows of carefully folded clothes she no longer wore. Dresses from office holiday parties. Jackets she bought during years when money felt stable. A silver bracelet her ex-husband once gave her before life became complicated and distant. She sat on the floor holding the bracelet in her hand for a long time before quietly placing it inside a cardboard box. Saturday morning arrived warm and bright. Evelyn set up a folding table outside her townhouse with old books, kitchenware, picture frames, and clothing neatly arranged beside handwritten price tags. Neighbors wandered past carrying iced coffee and shopping bags while soft country music played somewhere down the street. Evelyn smiled politely whenever someone stopped at her table, but inside she felt strangely hollow. Around noon, a teenage girl picked up the silver bracelet. "This is pretty," the girl said. "How much?" Evelyn hesitated only for a second. $5. The girl smiled and handed her a wrinkled bill before disappearing into the crowd. Evelyn stared down at the money resting in her palm. $5. It was amazing how an entire chapter of someone's life could eventually fit inside a stranger's pocket. By late afternoon, dark clouds rolled across the sky again. Evelyn packed the unsold items back into boxes while thunder rumbled somewhere far away. She suddenly felt too tired to go home. Too tired to sit alone inside that quiet apartment listening to the refrigerator hum and the clock tick and her own thoughts growing louder. So instead of turning toward her neighborhood, Evelyn kept driving. She rolled the windows down slightly and let warm humid air drift into the car, while the city slowly blurred past her. Nearly 20 minutes later, without fully meaning to, she pulled into the parking lot of a small park beside a lake she had not visited in years. The park looked almost forgotten at that hour of the evening. A narrow walking path curved around the lake while soft orange light from the setting sun reflected across the water like melted glass. A few ducks drifted lazily near the edge. Somewhere in the distance, children laughed near a playground before their parents called them home for dinner. Evelyn stepped out of the car slowly, stretching her stiff shoulders while humid air wrapped around her skin. She had not planned on stopping there. In truth, she had not planned anything at all lately. Most days simply felt like surviving 1 hour at a time. She began walking without direction, following the cracked sidewalk beside the lake while dry leaves scraped softly across the pavement. The exhaustion inside her felt deeper than physical tiredness. It was the exhaustion of pretending to stay hopeful when hope had quietly stopped answering back. After several minutes, Evelyn spotted an empty bench beneath a large oak tree near the water. She lowered herself onto it with a long breath and stared silently at the lake. For the first time all day, nobody expected anything from her. No applications. No interviews. No smiling. No pretending she was handling things better than she really was. Just silence. Real silence. Then she noticed the elderly woman sitting at the far end of the bench. Evelyn had not seen her at first. The woman looked to be in her 70s, maybe older, with silver hair pulled into a loose braid resting over one shoulder. She wore a pale blue sweater despite the warmth and held an old stainless steel thermos carefully in both hands. Large headphones covered her ears, and strangely enough, she was smiling softly to herself as if listening to an old memory only she could hear. There was something peaceful about her. Not cheerful exactly. Just calm in a way Evelyn had not felt in a very long time. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. The lake rippled quietly before them while evening birds crossed the darkening sky. Then, almost without thinking, Evelyn finally asked, "What are you listening to?" The elderly woman turned slightly, surprised but warm. She lifted one side of the headphones away from her ear. "Stories," she said gently. Evelyn blinked. "Stories?" The woman smiled again, her eyes lined with the kind of wrinkles that came from years of both grief and kindness. People telling stories about their lives. She held out an old cell phone toward Evelyn. On the screen was a simple image of a small glowing house beneath an evening sky. Above it were the words "The Warmest Place." Evelyn frowned slightly. "Is it a podcast?" "Something like that," the woman replied. "People talk about losing things. Starting over. Loneliness. Hope. Ordinary life." Evelyn gave a small tired laugh. "Sounds depressing." The older woman chuckled softly. "Sometimes it is. But sometimes hearing another person survive reminds us we can survive too." Evelyn did not answer right away. The woman studied her face carefully for a moment before asking, "Rough season?" Something about the question almost broke Evelyn apart. Maybe it was the gentleness in the woman's voice. Maybe it was because nobody had truly asked how she was doing in weeks. Most people only asked whether she had found another job yet. Evelyn looked down at her hands. "I lost my job recently," she admitted quietly. "After almost 20 years. The woman nodded slowly, as if she understood more than Evelyn had actually said aloud. "That kind of loss changes the way the world feels," she said. Evelyn swallowed hard. "I do not even recognize myself lately." The woman unscrewed the lid from her thermos and poured tea into the small metal cap. Steam curled softly into the evening air. "My name is Ruth Bennett," she said. "And for what it is worth, I think most people lose themselves at least once in life." Evelyn accepted the warm cup carefully. Chamomile tea. Simple. Familiar. Comforting. She realized suddenly how long it had been since anyone had offered her something without expecting anything in return. The two women sat quietly beside the lake while darkness slowly settled over the park. Somewhere behind them, streetlights flickered on one by one. Ruth placed the headphones gently into Evelyn's hands. "Here," she said softly. "Listen to this one." Evelyn hesitated before slipping the headphones over her ears. A calm voice filled the silence almost immediately. It was an older man talking about learning how to cook for himself after losing his wife of 42 years. His voice shook slightly when he described eating dinner alone for the first time. But then he laughed quietly while explaining how badly he burned the grilled cheese sandwich that night. Evelyn found herself smiling before she even realized it. And for the first time in many weeks, something inside her chest loosened just a little. That night, Evelyn sat inside her apartment long after midnight with the headphones still resting beside her laptop. Rain tapped softly against the windows while the glow from the kitchen light spilled across the dark living room floor. Normally evenings felt unbearably long now, but something about the voice she had heard at the park stayed with her. The older man talking about burnt grilled cheese sandwiches. The small laugh in his voice when he admitted he still set 2 plates on the table out of habit. There was pain in the story, but strangely, there was comfort too. It sounded honest. Human. Evelyn opened the website Ruth had shown her earlier. The page itself was simple. No flashy graphics. No advertisements screaming for attention. Just a quiet collection of audio stories uploaded by ordinary people. A widowed schoolteacher in Ohio. A truck driver rebuilding his life after bankruptcy. A retired nurse caring for her sister with dementia. Evelyn clicked on one story after another while the hours slipped by unnoticed. Some voices trembled with emotion. Others sounded calm and reflective. But all of them carried the same invisible thread underneath. Loneliness. Survival. The stubborn decision to keep moving forward anyway. Around 2 in the morning, Evelyn finally leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. For the first time in weeks, the noise inside her own head had grown quieter. Not gone completely, but quieter. The next afternoon, almost without planning to, Evelyn drove back to the park after lunch. She told herself she only wanted fresh air. But deep down she hoped Ruth might be there again. The lake shimmered beneath bright Florida sunlight while a warm breeze moved gently through the trees. Sure enough, Ruth sat on the same bench near the water, her silver braid resting against her shoulder while she sipped tea from the stainless steel thermos. This time, when she saw Evelyn approaching, she smiled immediately like she had been expecting her. "I had a feeling you might come back," Ruth said softly. Evelyn sat beside her and laughed quietly. "I think I listened to those stories for 6 hours last night." Ruth nodded knowingly. "That is how it starts sometimes." "Why does it help so much?" Evelyn asked after a moment. "Listening to strangers talk about their problems should not make me feel better, but somehow it does." Ruth looked out across the lake before answering. "Because pain becomes heavier in isolation. Human beings were never designed to carry life completely alone." Evelyn stared down at her hands. "Lately I feel embarrassed all the time," she admitted quietly. "Like I failed somehow. Like everybody else knows how to survive except me." Ruth turned toward her gently. "Most people are struggling more than they admit," she said. "Especially in America. Everyone is exhausted from pretending they are doing fine." Evelyn felt something tighten in her throat again. It amazed her how easily conversations with Ruth slipped past small talk and into honesty. Most people avoided difficult emotions. Ruth seemed to walk directly toward them without fear. The older woman unscrewed her thermos again and poured more chamomile tea into the metal cup. "After my husband died," Ruth said softly, "I stopped speaking to almost everyone for nearly a year." Evelyn looked at her in surprise. Ruth always seemed so calm, so steady. "Really?" Ruth nodded slowly. "Thomas and I were married 43 years. One morning he left for work, and by evening he was gone after a highway accident outside Jacksonville. She spoke without dramatic emotion, but the sadness still lingered quietly beneath her voice like an old scar. After the funeral, people brought casseroles for 2 weeks. Then life moved on for everyone except me. Evelyn listened carefully while wind rustled the trees overhead. I stopped answering calls. Stopped attending church. Some days I would sit inside the house without turning on a single light because darkness felt easier somehow. Evelyn could picture it vividly. The silence. The loneliness stretching across entire days. Ruth smiled faintly at the memory. One Friday evening, I wandered into a little community diner by accident. I thought it was a soup kitchen at first because so many elderly people were gathered there. She laughed softly. Turns out it was simply a place where lonely people came to eat together. Evelyn smiled despite herself. What happened? Nothing dramatic, Ruth said. That is the funny part. Nobody rescued me. Nobody gave some life-changing speech. A woman around my age handed me mashed potatoes and asked if I liked crossword puzzles. Ruth looked down at her teacup thoughtfully. But for the first time after losing Thomas, I did not feel invisible anymore. Evelyn sat quietly beside her while sunlight danced across the lake water. Somewhere nearby, a child laughed loudly before running past with a fishing pole nearly twice his height. Ruth glanced toward Evelyn again and smiled gently. Sometimes healing begins the moment another human being simply notices you exist. Over the next several days, Evelyn found herself thinking about Ruth constantly. Not in a dramatic way. More like the way people remember a song they unexpectedly heard at the right moment in life. The conversations at the park lingered quietly in her mind while she folded laundry, sat in traffic, or stared at another unanswered job application. Something about Ruth felt grounding. Steady. Like someone who had already walked through darkness and no longer panicked when shadows appeared again. On Tuesday afternoon, Evelyn returned to the lake carrying 2 iced coffees from a small drive-through cafe nearby. She spotted Ruth immediately beneath the oak tree, this time reading a paperback novel with her glasses resting low on her nose. I figured chamomile tea could use competition, Evelyn joked softly while handing her one of the coffees. Ruth smiled warmly. Well now, this friendship is becoming official. Evelyn laughed for what felt like the first genuine time in months. They sat together for nearly an hour watching dragonflies skim across the water while distant thunderclouds gathered above the city skyline. Eventually Ruth began telling her more about the little community diner she had mentioned before. It started with a widow named Gloria, Ruth explained. She owned a tiny restaurant outside Sarasota after her husband passed away. Friday evenings were usually slow, so she started inviting elderly people from the neighborhood to come eat dinner together. Evelyn listened quietly while stirring melting ice around her cup. At first only 4 or 5 people showed up. Then more came the next week. Then more after that. Ruth smiled softly at the memory. It was never really about the food. Most people there could afford dinner at home. What they could not afford was loneliness. The words settled heavily inside Evelyn. She understood exactly what Ruth meant. Loneliness had a strange way of changing ordinary things. Dinner tasted different when eaten in silence. Even television sounded emptier in an apartment where nobody else lived. Ruth continued, people brought pieces of themselves into that diner. One man taught chess. Another repaired broken lamps for free. A retired teacher organized book swaps. Gloria eventually stopped charging for dessert because she said conversations were payment enough. Evelyn smiled faintly. She could picture the place clearly somehow. Warm lights. Mismatched chairs. Elderly strangers laughing softly over coffee refills while rain tapped against windows outside. Did it help you? Evelyn asked gently. Ruth looked out across the lake for several seconds before answering. More than therapy ever did. Her voice remained calm, but Evelyn noticed her eyes soften slightly. When grief isolates you long enough, you begin believing nobody could possibly understand your pain. Then suddenly someone across the table says something painfully familiar, and you realize suffering is not unique. Human beings break in similar ways. Evelyn swallowed quietly. I think I forgot that. Most people do, Ruth replied. Especially after hardship. We become convinced we must solve everything alone. The breeze shifted cooler as storm clouds rolled overhead. Nearby, a young couple pushed a stroller along the walking path while an older man fed pieces of bread to ducks near the shoreline. Ordinary people living ordinary lives. Somehow the sight comforted Evelyn now instead of making her feel left behind. Ruth suddenly reached into her bag and pulled out a small notebook with worn blue covers. Here, she said, handing it over. What is this? Evelyn asked. Write something tonight. Evelyn looked confused. About what? Ruth smiled. Anything. A memory. A fear. A moment from your day. Most people spend years carrying thoughts nobody else ever hears. Evelyn flipped through the notebook slowly. The pages were blank except for one sentence written neatly near the front in faded ink. Sometimes being heard is the beginning of healing. Evelyn stared at the words longer than she expected to. Later that evening, after returning home, she sat at her kitchen table while rain moved softly against the windows again. The apartment still felt quiet, but not quite as heavy as before. Evelyn opened the notebook Ruth had given her and stared at the blank page under the warm yellow kitchen light. For nearly 10 minutes she wrote nothing. Then finally, slowly, she began writing about the day she lost her job. About the rain in the parking garage. About the humiliation of rejection emails. About feeling invisible at 45 years old. The words poured out more honestly than she expected. By the time she finally stopped, tears rested quietly on her cheeks. But strangely, she did not feel weaker afterward. She felt lighter. Outside, thunder rolled softly across the Florida sky while Evelyn sat alone at the kitchen table reading her own thoughts back to herself for the very first time. The next morning, Evelyn woke up before sunrise without the familiar heaviness crushing her chest. The apartment was still quiet, the bills were still stacked beside the microwave, and her future remained painfully uncertain, but something inside her felt slightly different. Softer somehow. Like a window had been cracked open inside a room that had not seen fresh air in years. She walked barefoot into the kitchen and reread the pages she had written in Ruth's notebook the night before. The handwriting looked messy in places where tears had blurred the ink, but the words felt real. Honest. Evelyn realized she had spent most of her adult life speaking carefully for other people's comfort while quietly ignoring her own emotions. At nearly 45 years old, she could not remember the last time she had truly said what she felt without filtering it first. Later that afternoon, Evelyn sat on the balcony outside her apartment holding her phone while warm Florida wind moved gently through the palm trees nearby. She opened the Warmest place again and listened to another story. This one came from a woman in Arizona who described rebuilding her confidence after losing both her marriage and her small business within the same year. The woman laughed softly at one point while talking about learning to eat alone at restaurants without feeling ashamed. Something about the honesty of it made Evelyn smile. Ordinary people speaking openly about ordinary pain. Somehow that simple idea still felt rare in the world. For several days, Evelyn continued returning to the park after lunch whenever she could. Some afternoons Ruth talked more than Evelyn did. Other days they simply sat beside the lake in comfortable silence while ducks drifted across the water and elderly couples walked slowly along the trail. One evening, Ruth asked Evelyn a question that lingered in her mind long after she returned home. What made you happy before life became survival? Evelyn had stared at the lake for a long moment before answering. The ocean, she finally admitted quietly. Ruth turned toward her with interest. The ocean? Evelyn nodded. Years ago, before everything became schedules and bills and responsibilities, I used to drive to the coast constantly. I loved tide pools, fishing docks, watching people work on boats. I even bought a cheap underwater camera once because I wanted to film coral reefs during a snorkeling trip. Ruth smiled gently. What happened to that version of you? Evelyn gave a tired laugh. Life happened. But later that night, she found herself digging through old storage boxes inside her hallway closet until she uncovered the dusty camera wrapped inside a faded beach towel. She sat cross-legged on the floor holding it carefully while memories drifted back one by one. Sunburned afternoons near the Gulf Coast. Seashells scattered across motel dressers. The feeling of salt water drying on her skin while gulls circled overhead. Back then, she had noticed beauty naturally. Somewhere along the way, survival had replaced wonder. The following Saturday morning, Evelyn drove nearly an hour to a quiet beach south of Clearwater carrying the old camera in her bag. The sky stretched bright blue above the ocean while waves rolled gently toward shore. Families unfolded beach chairs beneath colorful umbrellas. Fishermen stood patiently along the pier with coolers beside their feet. Evelyn walked slowly across damp sand while breathing in the familiar scent of salt and sunscreen and warm air. For the first time in months, her mind stopped racing for a little while. She filmed pelicans diving into the water. Tiny crabs disappearing beneath the sand. Sunlight reflecting across the tide pools near the rocks. Nothing important. Nothing dramatic. Just small moments that felt strangely alive. That evening, sitting alone at her kitchen table, Evelyn uploaded a short video online almost impulsively. The clip lasted barely 3 minutes. Soft ocean sounds played while she quietly described how peaceful the shoreline felt after difficult seasons in life. She almost deleted it twice before posting. Who would even care about something so simple? The next morning, while drinking coffee in sweatpants beside her laptop, Evelyn noticed 3 comments beneath the video. One person thanked her for the calming sounds. Another said the ocean reminded them of childhood vacations with their father. A third person simply wrote, "I really needed this today." Evelyn stared at the screen longer than necessary. It was such a small thing. 3 strangers. 3 comments. Yet warmth spread quietly through her chest anyway. That afternoon, she drove back to the park with an unfamiliar feeling growing inside her. Not happiness exactly. But maybe the first fragile version of hope. Over the next few weeks, Evelyn slowly built a routine around the small pieces of peace she had rediscovered. In the mornings, she still searched for jobs and sent applications across Florida and neighboring states. She adjusted resumes, rewrote cover letters, and sat through exhausting online interviews while trying not to sound desperate. But afterward, instead of collapsing emotionally the way she used to, she would drive somewhere quiet with her camera. Sometimes it was the beach. Sometimes a marina filled with weathered fishing boats rocking gently against wooden docks. Once she spent nearly an hour filming an elderly man feeding seagulls beside a bait shop while country music drifted softly from an old radio nearby. Evelyn uploaded short videos every few days without expecting much from them. Small moments. Calm narration. Ordinary life viewed gently instead of rushed past. To her surprise, people kept returning. The comments beneath her videos slowly multiplied. A retired woman in Oregon said Evelyn's ocean videos helped ease her anxiety at night. A truck driver from Alabama wrote that he listened during rest stops because the sound of waves reminded him of home. One message in particular stayed with her. "Thank you for making the world feel softer for 10 minutes. Evelyn read that sentence 3 times before quietly setting her phone down beside her coffee cup. Nobody had described anything she created as meaningful in a very long time. One Thursday afternoon, while editing footage at her kitchen table, her phone suddenly rang with an unfamiliar number from Tampa. Evelyn nearly ignored it out of habit. Lately most unknown calls were spam or dead offers. But something told her to answer. Hello? Hi, may I speak with Evelyn Harper? A professional voice asked. This is Evelyn. My name is Karen Mitchell from Bayside Medical Systems. We interviewed you last week for the administrative coordinator position. Evelyn straightened immediately in her chair. Her heartbeat quickened. Yes, of course. There was a brief pause before the woman continued warmly. We would like to offer you the position if you are still interested. Evelyn closed her eyes for a second, almost unable to process the words. For several weeks she had trained herself to expect disappointment from every conversation involving employment. I am interested, she said carefully, her voice softer than usual. After the call ended, Evelyn sat motionless at the kitchen table staring at the wall while afternoon sunlight stretched across the apartment floor. Relief washed through her slowly rather than all at once. Not excitement exactly. More like finally reaching air after being underwater too long. That evening she drove to the park carrying 2 coffees again. Ruth was already waiting on the bench beside the lake wearing a light gray sweater despite the warm weather. The moment Evelyn approached smiling, Ruth seemed to understand immediately. You found work, she said before Evelyn even spoke. Evelyn laughed softly in disbelief. How did you know? Ruth grinned. Your shoulders are not carrying the world tonight. Evelyn sat beside her and told her everything about the job offer while ducks drifted peacefully across the darkening lake. Ruth listened carefully, genuinely happy for her. But after a while Evelyn surprised herself by saying something unexpected. The strange thing is, getting another job does not feel like the biggest thing that happened to me this month anymore. Ruth turned toward her quietly. Evelyn looked down at her hands before continuing. A few months ago I thought employment was the only thing keeping my life together. But now, she hesitated, searching for the right words. Now I think losing that job forced me to realize how disconnected I had become from myself. From people. From life. Ruth nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. Pain has a way of exposing empty places we ignored while staying busy. Evelyn smiled faintly. I still upload videos almost every day now. I know, Ruth replied casually. Evelyn blinked in surprise. You watch them? Ruth laughed softly. Every single one. Evelyn shook her head while smiling into her coffee cup. Some nights hundreds of strangers leave comments talking to each other beneath the videos. It is strange. People open up online more honestly than they do face-to-face now. Ruth looked out across the lake while evening lights flickered on around the park. That is because loneliness is everywhere, she said quietly. Most people are simply waiting for permission to admit it. The words stayed with Evelyn long after she returned home later that night. Around midnight, unable to sleep, she opened her channel again and slowly scrolled through the growing comment section beneath her recent uploads. People from different states. Different ages. Different lives. Yet somehow all searching for the exact same thing. Comfort. Understanding. Connection. Evelyn sat quietly in the glow of her laptop while an unfamiliar thought slowly formed inside her mind. Maybe what people needed most was not just content to watch. Maybe they needed a place to belong. The new job at Bayside Medical Systems brought structure back into Evelyn's life. Her mornings became filled with schedules, phone calls, spreadsheets, and meetings again. She drove through downtown Tampa before sunrise with coffee in the cup holder and local radio humming softly through the speakers. To most people around her, she probably looked normal again. Stable. Recovered. But something inside Evelyn had permanently changed during those difficult months of unemployment. She noticed things now that she used to overlook. The exhausted cashier rubbing her eyes at the grocery store. The older man eating lunch alone in his car outside an office building. The woman sitting silently at the park staring at nothing while pretending to scroll through her phone. Evelyn recognized loneliness everywhere now because she remembered exactly how it felt to disappear inside it. Her online videos continued growing slowly during the evenings after work. Nothing viral. Nothing flashy. Just quiet moments from ordinary life. Sunsets over the marina. Rain against apartment windows. Small cafes near the coast where retired couples drank coffee together every morning. Evelyn spoke gently during the recordings. Almost the same way Ruth spoke beside the lake. Calm. Honest. Unhurried. And somehow people responded to that more deeply than she expected. The comments beneath her videos no longer looked like random internet conversations. They began sounding more like confessions. One night, a man named Harold wrote that he had not spoken to another person all week since retiring. A young single mother admitted she played Evelyn's videos quietly at night because silence inside her apartment made her anxiety worse. A woman from Michigan shared that she had recently lost her sister and did not know how to explain the grief to anyone around her. Evelyn spent nearly 2 hours replying to strangers that evening. Not with advice. Just kindness. Sometimes people did not need solutions. They simply needed to feel heard. A few weeks later, while sitting at the kitchen table after dinner, Evelyn opened a private online group connected to her channel almost impulsively. She stared at the empty page for several minutes before typing a simple description. A quiet place for ordinary people who need connection, conversation, and kindness. She named it the Warmest group. At first only a handful of people joined. Mostly regular viewers from the channel. Evelyn worried it might feel awkward or forced. The internet was already full of loud opinions and endless arguments. But something unexpected happened instead. People began introducing themselves gently. A retired mailman from Georgia posted photos of tomatoes growing in his backyard garden. A nurse from Texas shared recipes she cooked after long hospital shifts. Someone uploaded a picture of a golden retriever sleeping upside down on the couch, and dozens of strangers laughed together in the comments beneath it. Slowly, the space transformed into something warmer than Evelyn had imagined. One rainy Tuesday night after work, Evelyn sat curled beneath a blanket on the couch scrolling through conversations inside the group while thunder rolled softly outside. An older widower named Frank posted a blurry photograph of scrambled eggs and toast on a paper plate. "First meal I cooked since my wife passed away last year," he wrote beneath the image. "Burned the toast a little, but I am trying." Hundreds of comments appeared underneath within hours. People congratulated him. Shared simple cooking tips. Told stories about learning to live alone after loss. Frank replied to nearly every comment personally. Evelyn stared at the screen with tears quietly forming in her eyes. It was such a small thing. Burned toast. Eggs. Strangers being kind to someone they would probably never meet. Yet somehow it felt deeply important. Another evening, a young woman named Caitlin posted that she had finally gotten hired after 8 months of unemployment. Group members from different states flooded the comment section celebrating with her as if she were family. Someone even uploaded a photograph of a cupcake with a candle beside it saying, "Celebrating for you from Arizona tonight." Evelyn laughed softly when she saw it. But beneath the laughter was emotion she could barely explain. Healing was happening here. Real healing. Not through experts or expensive programs or motivational speeches. Just human beings showing up for one another in small, ordinary ways. Late one night, long after the city outside her apartment had gone quiet, Evelyn sat alone in the glow of her laptop watching conversations continue inside the Warmest group. A woman grieving divorce received encouragement from strangers across the country. 2 retired veterans discussed fishing in Louisiana. Someone shared photos from a morning walk beside the ocean at sunrise. Evelyn leaned back slowly against the couch cushions while emotion rose quietly in her chest. Months earlier she had believed losing her job was the worst thing that could happen to her. But now she understood something different. Sometimes life breaks apart only to reveal connections we were too busy to notice before. And somewhere beyond the dark windows of her apartment, scattered across cities and small towns all over America, lonely people were slowly finding one another in the soft glow of computer screens during the middle of the night. One cool October evening, nearly a year after losing her job, Evelyn sat alone on her apartment balcony wrapped in a light sweater while the city glowed softly beneath the darkening sky. Autumn in Florida was subtle compared to northern states, but the air carried just enough coolness to make people linger outside a little longer. Somewhere nearby, wind chimes moved gently in the breeze while distant traffic hummed beyond the palm trees. Evelyn balanced her laptop carefully on her knees and opened the Warmest group like she did almost every night before bed. More than 40,000 people had joined now. The number still startled her sometimes. What began as a few lonely strangers sharing stories beneath quiet ocean videos had slowly transformed into something much larger than Evelyn ever intended. Yet somehow, despite its growth, the group still felt deeply personal. Every evening new posts appeared from people across the country simply trying to make it through life a little less alone. A retired school principal in Nebraska shared photographs from the small woodworking projects he built after losing his wife. A young father in North Carolina admitted he was struggling with depression after being laid off from a manufacturing plant. Hundreds of strangers responded with kindness before sunrise. Evelyn scrolled slowly through the conversations while warm light from the apartment kitchen spilled across the balcony floor behind her. One post stopped her completely. A woman named Denise from Seattle had uploaded a photograph of a hospital waiting room late at night. "My mother is having surgery tomorrow," she wrote. "I did not know who else to talk to tonight." Beneath the post, comments poured in from every direction. People prayed for her mother, shared stories about surviving similar fears, offered encouragement from kitchens, bedrooms, truck stops, and quiet homes scattered all across America. Evelyn stared at the screen while emotion tightened gently inside her chest. Months earlier, these people had all been strangers carrying invisible loneliness through separate lives. Now they were comforting one another in the middle of the night without expecting anything in return. Her phone buzzed softly beside her. It was a text message from Ruth. "Still awake?" Evelyn smiled immediately. "Always," she typed back. 20 minutes later, she found herself driving through quiet streets toward the familiar park beside the lake. Ruth sat on the same old bench beneath the oak tree wearing a cream-colored sweater while holding her stainless steel thermos between both hands. The lake reflected silver moonlight across its surface while crickets hummed softly in the grass nearby. Evelyn sat beside her with a long peaceful breath. "You know," Ruth said quietly, "I had a feeling from the beginning that you were going to build something meaningful." Evelyn laughed softly. "I thought I was just uploading beach videos." Ruth smiled. Sometimes healing begins in very small ways. For a while they sat together in silence watching ripples move gently across the dark water. Then Evelyn finally spoke again. "I spent so much time believing losing my job destroyed my life." Ruth glanced toward her calmly. "And now?" Evelyn looked down at the glowing screen of her phone where notifications from the Warmest group continued appearing one after another. "Now I think it forced me to notice people." Her voice softened slightly. "Including myself." Ruth nodded slowly as if she already understood. Most people go through life starving emotionally while pretending they are fine. They smile at work, pay bills, watch television, sleep beside glowing phones. But deep down they are desperate for connection. Evelyn leaned back against the bench while cool wind moved gently through the trees overhead. "Do you ever think modern life made loneliness worse?" she asked quietly. Ruth smiled sadly. "I think modern life made loneliness quieter. That is why it became harder to notice." The words lingered between them while the city remained peaceful in the distance. Later that night, after returning home, Evelyn opened the Warmest group one final time before bed. thousands of conversations continued unfolding beneath the soft blue glow of her screen. An elderly man shared photographs from his morning fishing trip. A nurse working overnight in Chicago thanked strangers for keeping her company during difficult shifts. A college student admitted she had not felt this emotionally safe in years. Evelyn sat silently in the dark apartment while tears gathered gently in her eyes again, but this time they were different from the tears she cried in the parking garage months ago. Those tears came from fear and isolation. These came from gratitude. Outside her window, most of the city had already fallen asleep. Apartment lights clicked off one by one while highways slowly emptied into silence. But somewhere beyond the darkness, thousands of ordinary people were still awake together. Listening. Sharing stories. Comforting strangers they would probably never meet. And for the first time in a very long time, Evelyn realized something beautiful. Human beings were never meant to survive life alone.